History Secrets.
How does a civilization control millions of people without them realizing it? This question runs through history since the earliest human societies. China, the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and Egypt didn't just survive. They dominated. Each found a different solution to the same fundamental problem: social control. In China, the answer was bureaucracy, a rigorous system based on exams that directed all the energy of the population. For centuries, entire families lived with a single goal: to ensure their children passed the imperial exams. This mechanism created order, predictability, and stability. Interestingly, this model still exists today, just under a different name. In the Indus Valley, the strategy was completely different. There, control did not come from competition, but from equality. A religion based on harmony, peace, and social balance shaped the society. This system would later become the foundation of what we now know as Buddhism. In Mesopotamia, the scenario was different. With no natural barriers, war became inevitable. External instability generated internal cohesion. Collective survival depended on constant conflict. And then, Egypt. A civilization that took control to a radically different level. There, power was not just political. It was divine. The pharaoh did not rule merely as a leader. He was considered a living god. But there was a silent problem in this structure. The pharaoh was human, and a human at the top of an absolute empire lives under constant threat. Conspiracies, betrayals, internal disputes. The question then changes: what truly defines a great leader? On the surface, we learn familiar answers: responsibility, wisdom, empathy, knowledge. But history seems to point in another direction, an uncomfortable direction. Great leaders are not just prepared, they are shaped to survive in extreme environments. And for that, three characteristics repeatedly emerge. The first is unpredictability. A leader who cannot be predicted cannot be easily manipulated. The second is high stress tolerance. Pressure, criticism, hatred, all become irrelevant. And the third is the absence of empathy. The ability to make decisions without being paralyzed by the suffering of others. These three characteristics, when combined, form something deeper. A specific psychological state. An internal rupture. We call this dissociation. Dissociation is not just a clinical concept. It is a powerful mental mechanism. It is the ability to detach from one's own experience, to observe oneself as if you were another person, like a spectator inside your own body. This state creates an emotional distance that allows actions impossible for most people. And it is precisely this distance that transforms behavior. Unpredictability arises because there is no fixed self. Stress tolerance appears because pain is not felt in the same way. And the lack of empathy manifests because others are no longer perceived as equals. But why does this work? The answer may lie in something even more complex: the dynamics of social games. In systems with millions of individuals, winning does not depend only on skill. It depends on positioning. Alliances, hidden interests, invisible connections. True power lies in occupying multiple spaces at the same time. But this creates a problem: loyalty. If you belong to multiple groups, how do you avoid being controlled by one of them? The solution is to fragment your own identity, to create different versions of yourself for each context. One person in each environment. A mind that constantly adapts. This type of mind cannot be easily understood, and therefore cannot be easily dominated. Now, return to Egypt. If the pharaoh is born into power, how do you transform him into this type of mind? How do you create multiple identities within a single person? The answer may lie in something that at first glance seems merely symbolic. Mythology. Ra, Osiris, and Horus are not just characters. They represent distinct psychological states. Ra embodies the absolute hero, the force that faces chaos daily. Osiris represents the victim, the one who suffers, is betrayed, and destroyed. And Horus symbolizes revenge, the active response against injustice. Three archetypes, 3 identities. But what if this wasn't just a story? What if it was a script, a system to be enacted, experienced, and internalized? Because in Egypt, the pharaoh did not just believe in these gods. He became them through rituals, intense experiences, and altered states of consciousness. The goal was not to teach, it was to reprogram, to create memories that were not just remembered, but felt as real. Here, a crucial concept emerges. Reality is not perceived directly. It is interpreted by the mind. If you control someone's experience, you control their memories. And if you control their memories, you control who that person is. This idea, discussed by philosophers like Kant, reveals a fundamental limit. We cannot access reality itself, only what we perceive of it. This opens an unsettling possibility. If perception can be manipulated, identity can too. And it is exactly at this point that one of the most controversial mechanisms emerges: human programming. Intense experiences, combined with altered states, can create deep impressions, so deep that they bypass consciousness and begin to operate in the subconscious, transforming behavior, decisions, and reactions without the person realizing it. This logic is not just theoretical. It explains why extreme training works, why repetition shapes skills, and why certain responses seem automatic. But in the case of Egypt, this may have gone much further, far beyond training, far beyond education. Perhaps it touched something deeper, something that completely redefines what we understand as identity. What if the human mind could be shaped like a system, programmable? This idea may seem extreme, but when we observe certain historical patterns, it begins to make sense. In ancient Egypt, power was not just inherited, it needed to be sustained, and sustaining power required something beyond strength or intelligence. It required absolute internal control, the kind of control that does not waver in the face of fear, pain, or doubt. But how do you create this in a human being? A possible answer lies in the combination of 2 extreme elements: intense experience and altered states of consciousness. Rituals. According to this interpretation, the pharaoh did not merely observe mythology, he experienced it. Under effects that amplified perception, every event was felt as real. Every pain, every fear, every action. The line between imagination and reality disappeared, and in this state, something profound happened. Identity began to fragment. Imagine being led to believe you are Ra, the god who fights chaos every night. You face a threat, attack, destroy. You feel the power, the responsibility, the need to win. Now, imagine being Osiris, betrayed, imprisoned, destroyed, an experience of extreme vulnerability. And then, Horus, the response, the revenge, the reclaiming of control. Each role lived not as a story, but as a real memory. The result is not learning, it is transformation. The mind begins to operate with multiple centers of identity, each activated by context, emotion, or stimulus. And here comes a crucial detail: the trigger. Certain sensory stimuli can activate specific mental states. Among them, one of the most powerful is smell. Scents have a direct connection to memory and emotion. A specific aroma can awaken deep sensations, instantly. If different identities are associated with different stimuli, then it becomes possible to activate them on demand. A leader, seemingly stable, can completely change behavior without realizing it. But there is another even more delicate element in this system: dependence. During intense experiences, especially under trauma, the mind seeks an anchor, someone who represents safety. In the Egyptian context, this figure was Isis, not just as a goddess, but as an active presence within the ritual. A voice, a figure, an emotional support. Over time, this presence becomes essential. The mind begins to associate safety, guidance, and trust with this figure. And this creates something powerful: influence. If this voice can access the pharaoh in vulnerable states, then it can guide his decisions. Without resistance, without questioning. This type of structure does not depend on external force. It operates from the inside out. Now, expand this logic. What if this was not limited to Egypt? What if, at some level, we all operate in a similar way? In practice, we already do. We are different people in different contexts. At home, at work, among friends. Each environment activates specific behaviors. Each situation awakens a distinct version of ourselves. This is not extreme dissociation, but it is a lighter form of the same mechanism. The environment shapes the active identity. And this reveals something important. The human mind is highly adaptable, and therefore, influenceable. But how far can this go? Consider a simple example. An elite athlete. Years of training have shaped his reflexes, his perception, his response. Now imagine he loses all conscious memory. He forgets who he is. He forgets his history. But when he steps onto the field, his body still responds. Because the training is not only in conscious memory, it is in the subconscious, in the automatic system. This is the key point. If behavior can be conditioned, then identity can also be influenced, and in extreme contexts, even directed. This line of thought leads to an unsettling conclusion. With the right stimuli, repetition, and intensity, it is possible to shape automatic responses, to create patterns that activate without conscious decision. This raises controversial hypotheses about control, about conditioning, about the limits of human autonomy. But it is important to keep one point clear. Much of what is being described here is interpretative, a possible reading, not a definitive statement. Even so, there is one element that runs through this entire discussion: the near-death experience. Reports from people who were at the edge of death and returned. These experiences have something in common: a sensation of leaving the body, a state of intense peace, and often a complete review of one's life, as if every action were relived, but now feeling the impact caused on others. This type of experience profoundly alters perception. Values change, priorities change, identity itself can be reconfigured. Now connect this to what we saw earlier. Extreme states can reprogram the mind, and this raises a hypothesis. Were these states intentionally used in the past as tools of transformation? Or were they merely accidental discoveries, interpreted afterward? The answer is not clear, but the question remains. If the mind can be shaped by experience, then whoever controls the experience controls the outcomes. And this brings us back to the central point: power, not just as external authority, but as internal mastery. Mastery over fear, pain, identity, and perception. Perhaps this is what separates ordinary leaders from those who move through history, not necessarily more intelligent, but structured differently, capable of operating where others would collapse, capable of acting where others would hesitate, and, above all, capable of disconnecting. From this point on, the question ceases to be historical and becomes personal, because if these mechanisms exist at some level, then they do not belong only to the past. They are part of the structure of the human mind. And this completely changes how we see behavior. What we call decision may not be entirely conscious. What we call identity may not be entirely fixed. The mind is not a single, stable entity. It is a dynamic system, composed of multiple states, and these states can be activated. If you observe closely, you will notice this in everyday life. There are moments when you react with calm, others with impulsiveness. Sometimes you are rational, other times emotional, and in certain moments, you act in ways you do not even recognize afterward, as if you had been another person. This is not abnormal. It is the natural functioning of the mind in different contexts. But when this process is intensified, it can become something much deeper. Now, return to the idea of conditioning. If a stimulus is repeated many times, associated with a specific emotion. It creates an automatic response. This is the basis of almost all learning. But it can also be the basis of something more sophisticated. Behavioral programming. A sound, a word, a smell can activate specific internal states. And the more intense the association process, the stronger the response. This explains why certain environments completely change people's behavior. Why crowds act differently than individuals. Why symbols have so much power. And why narratives can mobilize entire societies. Now, imagine this principle being applied intentionally. Not just to teach, but to shape. To create internal patterns that operate automatically. From this point on, a delicate line emerges between influence and control. Because if a person responds automatically to certain stimuli, to what extent are they choosing? This question does not have a simple answer, but it reveals something essential. Human autonomy may be more limited than we imagine. This leads us to another central aspect. Trauma. Intense experiences, especially those involving fear, pain, or shock, have a much deeper impact on the mind. They are not just remembered. They are recorded at deeper levels. And often, they fragment perception, creating gaps, internal separations, or even distinct response patterns. This process is directly linked to dissociation. The mind distances itself from the experience to endure it, but in doing so, it creates a division. One part feels, another observes, and this division can be reused. If this structure is repeated and reinforced, it stops being a reaction and becomes a pattern, a permanent mechanism. And from that point on, identity ceases to be a continuous line. It becomes a set of states that can be activated, deactivated, combined. This does not necessarily mean loss of control, but it means that control can be influenced. Now, connect this to something even broader. Culture, religions, educational systems, traditions, all operate through repetition, symbols, and shared experiences. They create collective identity. They shape behavior. They define what is acceptable, desirable, or condemnable. And they do this so deeply that we rarely notice. Because for those inside, it feels natural. Perhaps this is the most important point. The greatest form of influence is not the one that imposes itself. It is the one that integrates. That becomes invisible. That is perceived as part of who we are. And when that happens, there is no resistance, because there is no perception of control. But this does not necessarily lead to a negative conclusion. In fact, it opens a possibility. If the mind can be shaped, it can also be understood. And once understood, it can be directed consciously. The difference lies in awareness of the process, between being guided and guiding. Perhaps the ancients discovered fragments of this functioning. Perhaps they explored, tested, experimented. Perhaps part of it was lost, and part evolved. But one thing remains. The human mind continues to be one of the most complex systems ever known. And at the same time, one of the most vulnerable. Vulnerable to experience, to repetition, to narrative, and to what we choose to believe. In the end, the question is not just about pharaohs, leaders, or ancient civilizations. It is about us, about how we think, how we feel, and how we become who we are. 'Cause if there is a secret in all of this, perhaps it is not hidden. Perhaps it is happening all the time. The past does not disappear. It remains recorded in ancient monuments, in forgotten texts, and in stories that have crossed centuries. Each discovery reveals a new enigma, and each enigma brings us closer to the truth. You are watching History Secrets. Subscribe and continue investigating the hidden secrets of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.